The first sound you hear is the sharp crack of bamboo in the wind, followed by the low murmur of a village waking at dawn. Beyond the misty rice fields rises the dark outline of a samurai estate. Inside its gates, order is absolute, and justice, swift, uncompromising, and sometimes terrifying, waits for anyone who breaks the codes of feudal Japan. For centuries, the samurai were not only warriors but also enforcers of law. Their ideals were bound to Bushido, the way of the warrior, a moral framework that prized honor, loyalty, and self-discipline. But behind the graceful calligraphy and polished armor lay a world where punishment could be as ritualized as it was brutal, designed to protect harmony by instilling deep fear of shame and disgrace. The Tokugawa era, beginning in the early 1600s, brought an unprecedented stability to Japan after generations of war. Yet that peace came at a cost. An intricate hierarchy governed every interaction, from the shogun's court to the smallest fishing village. The samurai, sitting atop the social ladder beneath the shogun and daimyo, wielded authority not only over military matters but also civil law. Their blades, and their words, decided the fate of commoners and fellow samurai alike. Imagine standing in the bustling market of Edo. Merchants hawk wares, the scent of grilled fish drifts through the air, and somewhere nearby, an official calls for silence. A man accused of theft kneels before a magistrate. The punishment might be as mild as public shaming, or as severe as mutilation or death. The choice depends on social status, intent, and whether the crime undermined the fragile order the shogunate worked so hard to maintain. One of the most infamous punishments was beheading, reserved for serious crimes like treason, murder, or rebellion. For samurai, however, death could be granted in a different form: seppuku. Far from a crude execution, seppuku was a ritualized suicide performed with solemn ceremony. A condemned warrior would compose a final poem, dress in white, and cut his abdomen with a short blade before an assistant ended his suffering with a swift stroke. It was a grim honor, offered only to those whose rank or service deserved a clean end. For commoners, punishments were often meant to warn as much as to penalize. Stocks and pillories were used in castle towns to display petty thieves or debtors. Branding marked criminals for life, burning symbols onto their arms or foreheads so that anyone could see their disgrace. Even minor offenses could invite harsh measures if they threatened the stability of the community. But samurai justice did not only rely on physical pain. The threat of social death, public humiliation, and loss of face was a weapon as sharp as any sword. A merchant stripped of his license, a farmer expelled from village rolls, or a samurai dismissed from service could lose everything in an instant. In a culture where reputation meant survival, these invisible punishments cut deep. One little-known aspect of Tokugawa law was the collective responsibility system known as ganingumi. Groups of 5 households were held accountable for one another's behavior. If one member committed a crime, the others risked fines or punishment unless they reported the offense. This fostered surveillance and control, binding neighbors together with threads of suspicion and duty. Some crimes demanded theatrical punishment, meant to teach through spectacle. A famous example was crucifixion or haratsuk. Used for rebels, murderers, or bandits, the condemned were tied to a cross-shaped frame and displayed at crossroads or riverbanks before execution. The sight warned travelers that lawlessness would not be tolerated. Even more macabre was the practice of exposing severed heads, placing the remains of executed criminals along busy routes to deter potential wrongdoers. For samurai themselves, discipline could be merciless. A retainer who insulted his lord might face dismissal or even death. A warrior who fled in battle or brought shame on his clan could be ordered to commit seppuku. The ceremony, though dignified, was a clear message. Dishonor was worse than pain, and redemption lay only through self-inflicted sacrifice. Yet justice in feudal Japan was not entirely untempered by mercy. Magistrates often weighed intention and repentance. First-time offenders, especially among peasants struggling to survive, might be spared the harshest outcomes. Buddhist and Confucian ideals encouraged rulers to balance firmness with compassion, though mercy depended on who you were and how your actions threatened order. Consider the case of peasants who protested high taxes. While riots were dangerous, shogunate records show that some leaders negotiated settlements, reducing levies to prevent unrest. But if demonstrations turned violent, authorities could unleash exemplary punishments, executing ringleaders or demolishing entire households to quell dissent. Women, too, were subject to samurai justice, though often through different channels. Female offenders, whether accused of theft, adultery, or poisoning, might face public humiliation, forced labor, or exile. Elite women could sometimes avoid corporal punishment through confinement or house arrest, reflecting both their status and rigid gender norms. Feudal Japan also knew the punishment of banishment called tsuho. Exiled to remote islands or distant provinces, the guilty were cut off from family, work, and social networks. For many, isolation was a fate nearly as grim as death. Despite the severity of these measures, it is striking how much attention was given to ceremony and symbolism. Justice was not only about retribution but about restoring harmony, reaffirming hierarchy, and warning others. Each sentence, whether a reprimand, an exile, or an execution, carried lessons about duty, loyalty, and the cost of rebellion. By the late Edo period, as Western ideas began to seep into Japan, reformers questioned the harshest penalties. Some domains reduced executions or introduced written codes to replace arbitrary rulings. But the underlying principle that society's balance required visible enforcement remained powerful until the Meiji Restoration swept away the shogunate in 1868. Samurai justice was a mirror of its age, steeped in honor, discipline, and control, but also capable of shocking cruelty. To understand it is to glimpse a world where law and morality were bound to swords, ink brushes, and an unyielding sense of order. As the sun sets over Edo's castle walls, the lanterns of night courts flicker to life. Here, under the scrutiny of samurai officials, disputes are settled and sentences pronounced. The scene captures the essence of feudal law, ritual, hierarchy, and the constant tension between mercy and severity. One of the most dramatic sentences handed down in this period was death by boiling, an extreme penalty reserved for treacherous arsonists or those who desecrated temples. Though rarely applied, its very existence served as a warning. Crimes that endangered public safety or offended sacred spaces would meet terrifying ends. Another punishment, less known outside Japan, was sawing in half or cutting at the waist, recorded in some early Edo sources for heinous crimes. While scholars debate how often such sentences were carried out, the fact they were codified in law reflects how far samurai rulers were willing to go to preserve order. More common, however, were beatings, fines, and confiscation of property. For peasants or townspeople, losing farmland or tools could destroy livelihoods. For merchants, officials might post edicts announcing their shame, barring them from future trade. Public exposure, rather than hidden suffering, was central to deterrence. Samurai accused of corruption or cowardice were subject to internal tribunals. The outcome could be exile, forced retirement, or seppuku. Accounts describe warriors delivering stoic last words before drawing their blades, accepting responsibility with rigid dignity. Punishment also extended to the realm of theater. Kabuki plays sometimes dramatized notorious cases, turning legal tragedies into moral tales. Audiences watched actors reenact executions or confessions, blurring entertainment and instruction. Even storytelling reinforced the message: honor your station or risk ruin. During famines or crises, law enforcement tightened. Theft of rice or tampering with granaries drew heavy sentences, for such acts threatened the survival of entire communities. Samurai guards patrolled storehouses, and severe penalties awaited those caught pilfering grain meant for relief. Feudal law also protected environmental resources. Illegal logging, poaching in shogunal preserves, or overfishing could bring stiff fines or corporal punishment. These measures reveal an early awareness of stewardship, justice not just for people, but for the land that sustained them. Yet the application of justice was uneven. Wealthy merchants could sometimes bribe officials, while peasants bore the brunt of strict codes. Women in particular walked a narrow line between protection and vulnerability. A wife who fled an abusive marriage without permission might be punished as a runaway, while brothel workers who violated contracts faced lashes or expulsion. Religious institutions sometimes played a moderating role. Buddhist temples offered sanctuary to desperate fugitives, buying them time to negotiate with authorities. Shinto shrines, too, symbolized purification. Some sentences included pilgrimages or rituals meant to cleanse moral stains. By the 18th century, intellectuals influenced by Confucianism and native ethics began advocating for proportionate sentencing. Manuals like the Kujikata Osadamegaki standardized procedures, curbing arbitrary cruelty. Officials were urged to balance deterrence with benevolence, reflecting a maturing legal culture. Still, the specter of violence lingered. Public executions drew crowds, and the shogunate sometimes displayed criminals at execution grounds for days, letting decay underscore the cost of lawlessness. Even as reforms spread, rulers clung to the idea that fear safeguarded peace. One of the last great displays of samurai justice came during the Ansei Purge in the 1850s. Suspected rebels and critics of the shogunate were arrested, interrogated, and in some cases executed. The crackdown showed that when power felt threatened, the old machinery of harshness could still roar to life. When the Meiji Restoration toppled the Tokugawa regime, Japan raced to adopt Western legal codes. The ornate punishments of samurai law faded, replaced by prisons and written statutes. Yet echoes of that earlier system remained in cultural memory, the valorization of honor, the cautionary weight of disgrace. Today, the ruins of magistrate offices and execution grounds stand as quiet witnesses. Visitors to historical sites in Kyoto or Kanazawa can still see preserved courtrooms where officials once deliberated over peasants, merchants, and warriors. Museums display bamboo pillories, written edicts, and rusted manacles, artifacts that speak to a past where justice was as much performance as policy. The story of samurai justice is ultimately a story of balance. Between violence and restraint, authority and ethics, individuality and social harmony. It reveals how a society sought order through a blend of spectacle, spirituality, and steel. Understanding these punishments does more than recount cruelty. It helps us grasp how people once imagined law, morality, and power. Behind every sentence was a philosophy that prized stability above all, a belief that the well-being of the many justified sternness toward the few. As lantern light fades on the era of the samurai, their legacy remains, woven into Japan's cultural fabric. From codes of conduct to modern legal caution, the lessons of that disciplined yet often merciless world endure, reminding us how justice shapes and is shaped by the values of its time.